Good afternoon and welcome to today's installment of the 2020 January series. I am Felicia Koki, a sophomore from Cameroon studying civil engineering and a member of the Food Recovery Network leadership team. Would you please take a moment to silence your cell phones? As you are doing so, I would like to welcome guests at all our 60 remote viewing locations, including Ripon, California, Anna Maria Islands, Florida, Savannah, Georgia, and Hastings, Michigan. We're so grateful that you're viewing with us today. And now, would you please join me as we open with a word of prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come together as a community and learn about how your name is being glorified. We praise you because you are the bread of life, and in you alone can we find fulfillment. You nourish our souls with your never-ending love and grace, and give us the strength to think deeply, act justly, and live wholeheartedly as Christ's agents of renewal in the world. Thank you for the work of your servant, Jeremy Everett, and bless him as he speaks to us today. Amen. And now, Pastor Mary Hulse, Calvin's chaplain, will introduce our guest.
Have you ever asked someone if they were hungry and they said to you, I could eat? I could eat is one of those offhand, throwaway comments that's spoken by someone who knows where their next meal is coming from. But for too many people, too many Americans, too many Michiganders, too many Grand Rapidians, too many of the people in the city where you are, for too many of them, the answer to, "Are you hungry?" is yes. Yes, I'm hungry, but I let my kids have the last of the cereal this morning. Yes, I'm hungry, but I don't get paid until next week. Yes, I'm hungry, but it's Thursday, and I can't get to any of the food pantries on Thursday. We live in a crazy world where many of us have to limit the amount of food we take in lest our pants get too tight. But we stand in line at the pharmacy behind someone who may be choosing to buy medication rather than food. Food insecurity is a reality for far too many people, and Jeremy Everett knows this. So he started the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, a capacity-building anti-hunger project within Baylor University in Waco, Texas. They partner with federal and state agencies, as well as numerous faith and community-based organizations, to develop and implement strategies to alleviate hunger through research, policy analysis, education, and community organizing. This is something that's dear to our hearts here at Calvin University. We have a chapter of the Food Recovery Network, a nationwide university-based organization that takes the food that is not eaten in the dining halls and then distributes it to local agencies. So here in Grand Rapids, Calvin students partner with such agencies as Safe Haven Ministries, South End Community Outreach Ministries, Matthews House, Supper House, and Dégagé. Students like Felicia are involved in leading that organization. That's exactly the kind of work that Jeremy will talk with us about today. He's the author of this book, I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis. After his presentation, you can buy his book and meet him in the West Lobby of the Covenant Fine Arts Center. Calvin University is grateful to Holland Home for underwriting today's presentation. Please welcome Jeremy Everett.
Well, it is good to be with you at Calvin. What a beautiful university. As a Texan who doesn't get to see snow very often, I know that y'all are tired of it, but I was going to see how can I bottle some of this up and take it home to my kids. And my 4-year-old, we've got a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 4-year-old. My 4-year-old said before I left, he said, Dad, make a snowman before you come home. So I don't think I'm going to. So don't tell them I'm not going to do it. I think it's too cold, right? It's too cold. No. Well, it is great to be with you. Thank you to the university for hosting me and as a part of such a wonderful series. I was going back through to see all of the wonderful speakers that you've had both this year and in years past. And what a distinguished group. And what a wonderful thing for a university to provide both to the community and to its students. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And Christy and her team, I think they invented hospitality. And so they do a wonderful job of representing you and the Grand Rapids community. Was thrilled to hear this morning about the Food Recovery Network, that your students are reclaiming all of their food and providing that to area nonprofit organizations and food banks. For those of you who are students and you're looking for a way to plug in, it sounds like a perfect way to plug in and join your brothers and sisters to feed the hungry in your community. Well, the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty grew out of a project that we call the Texas Hunger Initiative. The Texas Hunger Initiative really, for all practical purposes, has been our laboratory to try to figure out how we can end hunger and poverty in the world right around us. We have field offices all across the state of Texas with organizers working in those field offices every day, trying to innovate and develop new ways to address hunger in their local community with their local community. We also have about 60 researchers, half are Baylor faculty and then faculty members at other universities who are doing research and evaluation projects alongside of our field offices. And then we translate that into policy work in our work in Washington. So hopefully what we're trying to do is what we call informed engagement. We want our elected officials and our leaders across the country to be able to have information that can really inform them based in research and rooted in community activity that can lead to transformative action so that we can have a world without hunger. Well, I'm also a third-generation Baptist preacher's kid, and if I don't start with a passage from Scripture, I think my granddad and my father will be mad at me. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read us a passage out of Matthew 25, the I Was Hungry passage, of which my book is named, and a passage that you're probably pretty familiar with. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels are with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will begin to separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father in heaven. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of this world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me, naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me, in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick and in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it for the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into eternal fire prepared for you for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. I was naked, and you did not give me clothing. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me." Then they will also answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and didn't take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly, just as you did for the least of these, you did not do it for me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. The word of the Lord for God's people. Well, for me, When I felt the urge or the call to address the issue of poverty, I was just a junior in college. I didn't know enough about it. And so for me, I knew that I needed to move into low-income communities. And so much of the last 20 years, I've lived and worked in low-income communities from D.C. To San Antonio and even in Little Waco. The first house that I lived in with a group of seminary students that I was going to seminary with in Waco, and it was in North Waco, and it was an old house, and it was our introduction to slumlords. And now our house was a center of activity, so we would have people from all walks of life, from the neighborhood that would hang out at our house on a daily basis. The homeless would oftentimes be sleeping at our home, and our professors and fellow students would spend a lot of time there. It was sacred space with a lot of activity, but it was also an old home. And one of the problems that we had in that old home is that every time we ran the kitchen sink or turned on the shower, we could just hear it splashing underneath the house. It was a nasty problem. And so we called our landlord repeatedly to see if he could send a plumber over to fix our plumbing problem. And our landlord would either not answer the phone or he would just give us a reason why he couldn't send somebody over that day. Well, our front yard was actually kind of the center of prostitution in our neighborhood. And so we frequently had police officers that were policing in front of our house. And a police officer noticed that plumbing problem had seeped into our front yard. And so he knocked on our door and he said, "Listen, if you don't clean this problem up, we're going to red tag your house and you're going to be evicted." So we called our landlord and told him what the police officer said and said, "Please send somebody over." So finally, he reluctantly sent a plumber over to see what was going on with our house. Well, it was a bad plumbing problem, and it smelled as awful as you could imagine. And so the plumber that he sent over was a very full-sized plumber with a very full-sized apprentice, and we had a little hobbit-sized hole that he had to crawl through to get underneath our house. One of the joys of my life was watching him try to get through that hole, and I think it took him about a week. And so finally, once he and his apprentice squeezed through the hole, they were already mad. And they got underneath the house, and they saw how awful it was underneath the house. We could just hear them yelling at each other and splashing around underneath the house. So finally, they reemerged, and they're mad. And he picks up the phone, and he calls the landlord, and they're yelling at each other back and forth. And finally, he slams the phone down. He goes to his truck, slams his door, drives off, and we assume, because we're a bunch of middle-class kids living in the slums, that he was going to get plumbing pipe to come back and fix the plumbing underneath the house. Well, when he came back, he and his apprentice got out of the truck and they grabbed some concrete steps and they put them in the sludge in the front yard from our porch to our sidewalk, and then they slammed their door and they drove off, and that was the last we saw of them. Our slumlord's solution to our plumbing problem was concrete steps. Now, he did that so that we wouldn't walk through the sludge and ultimately get sick, but that certainly was not a good long-term solution. About a week later, we saw that same police officer that had knocked on our door the week before, and when he saw the slumlord's response, he was indignant. He was furious, and he said that he's going down to the city right then to get the house red tagged. Well, we called our landlord, and he reluctantly sent the plumber back over because he didn't want to lose the investment property that he had. The plumber went underneath the house and did the slow, difficult work of rebuilding the pipes. Had our landlord not done that, he would have lost his investment. He would have lost the little bit of rent that these broke seminary students were able to provide him on a monthly basis. It would have been a bad thing. And likewise, when we see these big social issues like hunger or poverty or human trafficking, they're just too big oftentimes for us to get our minds around. So what we typically do is we either try to avoid them, we try to pretend that they don't exist so that we can go about our good old our time and not deal with the complexity of these situations, or we do something like we put down concrete steps to just try to make it through the day. Getting down underneath the house to rebuild the broken pipes of injustice is difficult work. It's dirty work. It smells, and it takes a long time. But if we don't do it, ultimately we're going to lose the investment that we've made. What a wonderful country that we live in. And you think about all of the good things that we have going for us in our nation right now. But if we don't invest in creating systems that work for everybody, then ultimately the whole house is going to be torn down. Well, for the past 20 years, living and working in low-income communities, addressing social issues, there have been three things that I feel like that I've learned. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes reluctantly, but the three things that I feel like you have to be able to do or know to be able to address these big social issues like hunger and poverty, that you have to have proximity to the problem is the first one. If you don't have proximity to the problem, you can't solve a social problem from a distance, as Brian Stevenson would say. You have to be immersed in the reality. You can't possibly understand why somebody is hungry or the choices that they're making based upon one encounter that you have with a low-income person using a SNAP card in a grocery store line. But we do all the time. You have to have proximity to the problem. You have to be immersed in the issue. You think about Jesus as an incarnational witness. He came and lived and walked among us. And we must do the same thing with these social issues like hunger and poverty. You have to live and walk among the people. The second thing is you have to understand what research is suggesting, right? Oftentimes, we feel compelled to act, and we might even be moved to compassion, and our hearts might be in a good place, and so we go respond to human need, but we don't take the time to understand what the research is, and when we don't understand what the research is, then oftentimes we might do more harm than good. You remember when Haiti had the bad earthquake that hit Port-au-Prince? Well, there was a church from Kansas that sent a group down to respond to the disaster, which is a good thing. And they were in a small village just north of Port-au-Prince, and the villagers came to the church members and said, "Can you please take our kids to the Dominican to a children's home? We don't have any food or water here. We're in dire straits." And so they felt like they should do something, and so they got a van, and they tried to smuggle the kids into the Dominican to a children's home. Well, they were caught at the border, arrested on human trafficking charges, and spent almost 6 months in jail. It became an international incident. They didn't do their homework. They didn't understand that Haitian kids were oftentimes smuggled into the Dominican and then sent into human trafficking. They wanted to respond to need, but they needed to have more understanding, more context before they could move to a solution. The third thing is understanding our faith tradition. If Jesus lived and walked among us for 33 years, what did he say about, or did he say anything about these issues that we're giving our lives to? And if he did, what did he say? How did it move us? How should it move us? Well, for me, one of the neighborhoods that my wife and I lived in after living in Waco was San Antonio's West Side. Now, it's gained some popularity because Julian Castro, who briefly ran for president, he was one of, you all are probably running for president as well. I think we've got about 100 people running right now, and he was one of the 100, and he's from the West Side. I actually worked some with his mother, and if you knew his mom and she told you to do something, you would do it. And I think she told him to run for president, so he did it. He was a smart son. But that neighborhood was a very impoverished neighborhood, about 150,000 residents that were documented. Probably another 50,000 undocumented residents lived in that community. The median income was $19,000 per household. And typically you had 3 generations sharing a home in each house. And so not a lot of money to go around. The best high school we had in the neighborhood had a 50% dropout rate. So it was very poor. And not only was it poor today, what we were looking at is that it was going to be poor for another generation. Well, as we got to know our neighbors, we bought a small little house in the neighborhood, and it was my wife and our oldest son at the time, and we used to comment sometimes sitting around the dinner table. We used to feel sorry for our neighbors because they had 19 people living in a small 2-bedroom house without air conditioning in South Texas. They had one little window unit in the matriarch and patriarch's room in the back of the house, and so anytime they had babies in the house, they would stay in the room with the grandparents where they could turn on the AC unit and on those hot South Texas summer nights. Well, we would comment sometimes sitting around the dinner table how sorry we felt for them. You know, there were only 3 of us in our little 3-bedroom house, and they had 19 people living in their 2-bedroom house. And one day I pulled up in my driveway after I returned from work, and the matriarch was watering the one little lone rose bush in between our 2 properties. And she motioned for me to come over when I pulled in, and so I did, and I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "I just want you to know that our family feels so sorry for you." And I said, well, why is that? And she said, "It must be so lonely living in that house all by yourselves." It gave this little middle-class guy some perspective. Well, that neighborhood was left an indelible mark on my life. And part of it was because of another neighbor, a woman named Lupe. Lupe knew the ticket out of poverty for her kids, her 8 children, was education. So she was a fierce advocate for them to graduate from high school and hopefully go to San Antonio Community College. That was a goal for all of her children. Her husband, Luis, was the only person on our block that had full-time hours with one employer. Everybody else had to piece together employment. And so it's called underemployment. So they might have a 20-hour-a-week job at one place and 10 hours somewhere else, and they might try to put 20 or 30 hours together wherever they could find work to be able to try to make ends meet. Well, she also was the primary caregiver to her 2 wheelchair-bound parents who lived with them. And so every day, Luis would go off to work. He would take their one little car and go off to work. And then Lupe would send her kids off to school, and then she would get her 2 wheelchair-bound parents situated at a senior center close to our home. And then she would make her way down to the schools where she would volunteer. And she wouldn't just volunteer with her kids, she would volunteer with all the kids in the community because she wanted to see everybody succeed. She was a legend. Well, like many of us, she got an ear infection. We've all gotten ear infections before. Only she didn't have health insurance. Very few people in our neighborhood had health insurance. And so she waited until her eardrum got too painful to bear. That infection got too painful to bear, and she caught a bus and she went down to one of the local emergency rooms, and she sat there all day waiting to be seen, but the room was crowded and her name was never called, and she knew that she needed to get back home before her elementary age kids got out of school. So she caught the bus and went back home. But later that evening, her eardrum ruptured. The infection went into her brain. She fell into a coma, and she never woke up. A few days later, her husband and her kids were going door to door in the neighborhood, raising money for a memorial service so that they could bury their mother. She left 8 kids behind because she couldn't afford or have access to a simple antibiotic. Her husband came to my house and he sat with me on my front porch and he just buried his head in his hands and began to weep, and he said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Our economic hardships are not evenly spread out among society. Rather, it's the same family struggling with bouts of hunger. They regularly had their lights turned off because they couldn't afford power. It was not uncommon for them to not have enough food in the house to be able to provide for their entire family. It's the same family that struggles with bouts of hunger, that doesn't have affordable health care, and doesn't have livable wage paying jobs. Lupe and Luis were food insecure, underemployed, lacked health insurance, and so on. When I think of their story and widespread poverty in our country, I'm often reminded of FDR's famous quote, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to those who have an abundance. It's whether we provide enough for those who have too little." Well, as Christians, most of us are probably familiar with the gospel text that I read earlier. "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, an immigrant, and you welcomed me, sick and in prison, and you visited me." This is the only apocalyptic or eschatological scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew. And this time, Jesus, the King, has returned, and he's gathered all the people before him. And he begins to separate them, the sheep and the goats, the righteous from the accused, To the astonishment of the people gathered, the criterion for judgment wasn't confession of faith in Christ. Nothing was said of grace, justification, or the forgiveness of sins. What mattered is whether or not a person had acted with love and cared for the needy. These acts weren't just extra credit, but constituted the decisive criterion for judgment. Essentially, when the people responded or failed to respond to human need, they were in fact responding or failing to respond to Christ. The calling of the faithful is clear. Feed the hungry and you will live. Regretfully, we haven't lived up to it. We have 40 million Americans who live below the poverty line. 13 million of them are children. 4.5 million are senior adults. We also have that same group of 40 million Americans that are food insecure, which is the technical definition of hunger. It basically means that you don't have enough food to live an active, healthy lifestyle. 40 million Americans who are affected by the broken pipes of injustice. Surely we can do better than that. The richest nation in the history of the world. Surely we can do better than that. Well, I had the privilege of serving on the National Commission on Hunger a few years ago. It was a 10-member bipartisan commission developed by Congress essentially to assess the state of the union. They recognized that we had 40 million Americans that were experiencing hunger and that we had been investing in programs for the last 4 or 5 decades, some for almost a century. But it didn't seem like we were making as big of a dent as they wanted us to make. They also recognized that Republicans and Democrats weren't exactly getting along. And so they thought if we create a 10-member bipartisan commission, maybe they can figure out what's going on with hunger in the U.S. and make some recommendations back to us. And then from their consensus recommendations, maybe we can move forward. Now, what they did is they had 5 Democrats appoint 5 people, and then they had Republicans appoint 5 people. And so the irony is that so now we had this bipartisan commission. I felt like it was one of the honors of my life to be able to serve on that commission. And we sat around a room, and it was just like a committee at church, except that the table that we sat around was historic. And so we couldn't put our coffee cups on it. And just like everything in Washington, everything was old and antiquated, so you couldn't use technology or anything in the rooms. But anytime a Republican said something, a Democrat would disagree with them. And anytime a Democrat would say something, then the Republican would disagree with them. It didn't, the fact that it was a bipartisan commission didn't seem to matter. It seemed like just being in the Beltway, that just seeped into our very ethos. And so we decided we've got to shake up the system. So we did a couple of things. One, we invited experts from around the country to come and testify and to send to us their research. So we spent a year just learning everything that had been written over the past several decades about food insecurity in America. Then we went and traveled around the country where we held hearings. We would go into communities and meet with individuals who are food insecure. We would go and meet with organizations that were addressing the issue, and we'd have these big public hearings where we invite anybody that wanted to have their voice heard to come and have their voice heard on congressional record. And one of those locations that we went to was El Paso, Texas, a community where we had an office, and a community I thought I knew well, but I seemed to learn some new things. When we got there, one of the first things that we were invited to do was meet with a group of elderly who had met each other in a citizenship class they were taking. Now, this group of elderly, they had lived in the U.S. almost their entire lives. They'd raised their children here. They weren't rapists or drug smugglers. They had been car mechanics and owned their own businesses. They'd been custodians in hotels. Many of them had been farmers growing the food that we eat. A number of them had children that were in the Middle East on active duty as we spoke. And their one wish was to die as American citizens. And so even though they were experiencing extreme poverty, many of them were experiencing hunger, they were trying to save up every last penny they could put together to go towards being able to take their citizenship test so that they could die as U.S. citizens. It was an inspiring group of people. Towards the end of our conversation, I asked them pointedly, I said, "Do you have any food in the house?" And everybody looked away from me so that I wouldn't call on them. And one proud elderly woman kind of sat up and she straightened her dress. Her husband, who had this dignified chin and mustache, he looked like a Hispanic Tom Selleck, just kind of buried his head on his cane because he was embarrassed about the realities that they were living in. But his wife spoke on their behalf, and she said, occasionally we have food in the house. When we do, I normally make us a plate of beans and a couple of tortillas. She said, we're older now, so we don't need as much. Her husband then raised his head and he wiped the tears from his face and he said, remember us when you come into your kingdom. My congregation sings the Taizé chant, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. We sing that phrase over and over and over again. And as many times as I've read those words or I've sung that song, I've never imagined myself living in a kingdom now, but he was right. He and his wife and the rest of those members were going to go back to their homes of isolation, to a home with very little food, and I was going to go back to a nice hotel, have a nice meal, and then return to Washington to the halls of power to deliver our report. Remember us when you come into your kingdom. Well, that next morning, we came into that same facility. This time, there were hundreds of people gathered for a public hearing. We were there for 8 to 10 hours, listening to people provide important testimony that ultimately was reflected in our report. And midway through, an elderly man, a professor from Texas A&M, walked gingerly up, kind of using a cane, up to the podium that we were looking down on, and he wanted to have his voice heard. And his name was Dr. Joe Sharkey. And Dr. Sharkey said that he is a public health professor, and his job is to do public health research on the Texas-Mexico border and the colonias. And many of the colonias don't have running water or power or roads. People put their homes together with whatever they can find. So you might have one wall made of corrugated metal, another made of plywood, another from rocks from surrounding land. And he said that he sent his public health workers door to door to do a survey of questions. And one of his public health workers went to visit a woman, and she knocked on her door, and she was invited into the home, and she asked a survey's worth of questions. And then towards the end of the questionnaire, she asked a question similar to the one I'd asked the day before. She said, do you have any food in your house? And the woman in the colonia, she invited the public health worker over into this area that kind of served as her kitchen. She opened up her refrigerator door, and nothing was there except for a little bag of chicken bones. The public health worker was curious. She said, why in the world is there a bag of chicken bones in your fridge? She said, this way, when my children return home from school and they open up the refrigerator door, they'll at least see that something's there. Surely we can do better than this. Surely we can do better than this. Fortunately, there are wonderful people all over this country doing amazing things, turning two fish and 5 loaves into food for the multitudes. We were able to meet them too. 2 of the people that I met that were like this, I met early on in our work with the Texas Hunger Initiative. We had developed a model called Hunger-Free Communities, a coalition-based model. What we recognize is that hunger and poverty are too big for any one organization or one sector to be able to address by themselves. These are big social issues, and if you're gonna fix the broken pipes, you got to get underneath the house, and you're going to have to do it with a whole lot of folks. Well, we developed this model based upon some work that an organization in Washington called the Alliance to End Hunger had developed, and we began to see a lot of these hunger-free community coalitions emerge all across the country in our time on the commission. Well, when we kicked off THI, we had identified 6 pilot communities where we were going to try to build one of these coalitions. And after about 6 months, I got a phone call from 2 women from San Angelo, Texas. They were Sunday school teachers at Southland Baptist Church, Mary and Carol. And San Angelo was not one of the communities that we had chosen. And they called me and they said, Jeremy, we need to be a pilot community in San Angelo. And I said, okay. And they said, we just had 3 manufacturing plants close, and we now have 10,000 children on our free introduced lunch program. We've got a major hunger epidemic, and we need to be a pilot. And I said, well, I'm glad that you called, but unfortunately we've chosen our pilots for this year. Maybe call us back in a year. We had a small team at the time. I said, maybe call us back in a year, and We'll see if we can take you on then. Well, I'm married to a West Texan. I don't know what I was thinking. I think they put stubborn in the word stubborn. And I didn't know, there was no way in the world I was going to get them off the phone without doing what they said. And so these women acted as if I just didn't hear them the first time. So they spoke to me this time with a little hostility and a little louder. And they said, Jeremy, 3 manufacturing plants have just closed in our community. We've got 10,000 kids on the free and reduced lunch program. We need to be a pilot community. And so just to get them off the phone, I gave them essentially a community assessment to do that typically takes communities 6 to 9 months to complete. You have to learn everything that you could possibly learn about your community. I thought, well, at the very least, if they go through the assessment, it'll buy us maybe a year, and then maybe we'll be ready to take them on. Well, they called me back 3 weeks later. I kid you not, 3 weeks later. I don't know if they didn't sleep. I don't know what, but they finished it in 3 weeks. They said, Jeremy, we have our mayor, our city council, our school superintendent and school board. We have the nonprofits, our faith communities, our congressmen. Everybody is ready to come to the table so that we can be a hunger-free community coalition. Now can we be a pilot community? Well, I just laughed and I said, I think you already are. And so myself and a man named Bill Ludwig from USDA drove out to San Angelo in West Texas, and we sat down with the community, and they were ready to get after it. One of the things that they had learned through their community assessment is that they didn't have a summer meal program for their kids. So churches, before we even finished speaking, said, well, we've got commercial kitchens, we'll make the meals. And the nonprofit organizations and community rec centers said, well, you know what, we're located in low-income neighborhoods, we'll be summer meal sites. And the elected officials and the business leaders said, well, you know what, we'll pick up the food and we'll deliver it, and then we'll do enrichment activities with the kids, because we've heard that kids who are hungry oftentimes lose about a third of what they've learned the last year before the beginning of the school year over the course of the summer. With just a few months worth of planning, they served 20,000 meals to kids that otherwise wouldn't have gotten a meal. That was almost 10 years ago, and they've done it every summer since. Now they serve 30,000 meals to kids every summer. They have a community gardening initiative with gardens going in food deserts and areas that don't have fresh food access all over the community. They even have a SNAP outreach program to sign families up for SNAP, because they learned that this provides economic impact for their community. They learned that for every dollar that comes in through the SNAP program, what we used to call food stamps, people spend it in the grocery store. And then it has $1.79 worth of economic stimulus for every dollar that comes in the community. The grocery store says, oh yeah, we understand this program. It accounts for 1 in 10 of every job that we have. And so they began to rally around the hungry in their community, and they didn't do it for the hungry, they did it with the hungry, because they recognized that people who are hungry probably had better solutions than they did. And so they were right there at the table with them. Amazing work. We've seen that work all across the state. We now have almost 30 coalitions representing about 60% of our population. In Dallas, they learned that if they changed where they serve breakfast to kids, that they could greatly impact how many kids got breakfast. One of the things that teachers were coming to the administrators saying that we have almost 100% free and reduced lunch rate, 100% poverty rate, and that many of our kids are bugging us all throughout the morning wondering when lunch is going to be, because they're so hungry they can't possibly learn. So our director of research did a big project with Dallas Independent School District, and she found that when kids got access to breakfast at school, it increased academic performance, specifically in math and science. It also decreased discipline problems. It increased nutrient intake, had all kinds of benefits. And when they changed the location of where they served it, instead of serving it before school, they serve it the first 10 minutes of the class period, that it reduced the stigma of being the poor kid showing up before school to get breakfast. And a lot of kids, you're trying to avoid being labeled, so a lot of kids would choose not to show up and get breakfast even though they needed it, just because they didn't want that label as being the poor kid. And when they changed the location of where they serve breakfast, it went from 30 to 35% participation in the breakfast program to 90 to 100%. Then Dallas said, well, let's don't stop there. Let's work on after-school meals for our kids. And then let's work on summer meals for our kids. They now do 350,000 meals a day for the kids in their school district. It's because they care. It's because they work together across sectoral lines to figure out what they could do to solve a need in their community. So I'm going to give you a few steps to take. One, if you're going to address these big social issues, so if you remember, the first three were proximity, research, understanding your faith tradition. And if you're going to invest yourself in building these hunger coalitions, leadership moves at the speed of trust, right? And so you have to have trust, you have to build a collaborative effort, and you have to be committed to the cause. When you're dealing with these big social issues, you get one. You think about all the great change agents over the course of the 20th century, and they all got one big major issue before they died. And so you get one issue, so you have to have trust, you have to build a collaboration, and you have to have commitment. And the steps that we've built for these hunger-free community coalitions, you can find on our website, which is hungerandpoverty.org, but it's simple. First, you want to identify who's doing something in the community, and you pull them together. You find out everybody in the community that's doing something about hunger, and you find out what they're doing, and that's a simple part of the assessment process. And it's through that process that you're able to identify where the gaps of services are. There are great data sets for you. School district data is available to anybody that requests it. And so you can find out what's happening in schools in your community. Mapthemealgap.org. You can find out all kinds of information about economic conditions of low-income families and the rate of food insecurity in your community by simply going there and putting in your county or your zip code. So first, you bring people together. Then you identify what's happening, the state of the union in your community, and then you work with that coalition of the willing, the people that are willing to work together to build an action plan together across agency lines, across sectoral lines or organizational lines. You have a strategic plan to address that problem that you want to address, just like Mary and Carol did in West Texas. Then you assess to see if it worked, and then you start the process over again. That's how you build solutions to ending hunger and poverty, both on a state level, on a local level. It's not rocket science. You don't have to be a mathematician or a social worker. You can be two Sunday school teachers like Mary and Carol and do transformative things in your community. The results of these kinds of processes have resulted in hundreds of millions of additional meals for the hungry in our state, and we're seeing this happen all across the country, and we would certainly love to see you and the Calvin community lead those efforts here in your community. Well, let me leave you with this. The Gospel of Matthew points us towards God's judgment of us, and it's based upon recognizing who our neighbor is and responding to that neighbor in need. Likewise, we judge each generation based upon whether or not they further the cause of justice. This week we celebrated MLK Day, and it's not uncommon for us to reflect upon that time period every year and think about those that furthered the cause of civil rights during that era and those that opposed it. I went to college in Birmingham, and Kelly Ingram Park is where a lot of that activity happened in Birmingham. That's where Bull Connor and the Birmingham police officers turned their fire hoses on those young African-American protesters that day, those images that we've all seen. Whether we like it or not, we judge that generation based upon whose side they were on that day. I know that I likely have Southern-born family members that were on the side of Bull Connor and those Birmingham police officers that day. That's a sin that my family must carry with us and must repent from. But a story was told at my grandfather's funeral a few years ago. He had been a Baptist minister in southern Arkansas at that time. And he and my father and my grandmother were on their way home from church when they came across the home of an African-American family with a burning cross in their front yard. My grandfather pulled the car over, and he asked my dad to go inside to check on the family. And when my dad went inside, the children were all huddled in the back corner of the house with the lights out, scared to death, not knowing if they were going to live or die. Their parents were away at work. My grandfather then went over to the cross and he put the flames of the cross out, and then he stepped right to the edge of the street, and he peered into the woods across the street because he knew the Klansmen were watching everything go down. He yelled, "Cowards! Cowards, come out." How can you use this symbol of love as a symbol of hate? Whether we like it or not. That generation is judged based upon what they did to further the cause of justice. For those who are minorities in our communities. And whether we like it or not, we too are going to be judged based upon whether or not we further the cause of those living with hunger and poverty both in our community and around the world. And if we do, then may it be said to us on our final day, "Come you that are blessed by my Father in heaven, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of this world, for I was hungry and you gave me food." Thank you.
I'm Karen Soppy from the Department of English, and I want to start by asking you if there are agencies, say government versus NGOs versus community activities or church partnerships, that you find tend to get on board more quickly or work more successfully or less successfully.
Yeah. You know, like a lot of situations in life, the organizations that are oftentimes the largest, that are the most sophisticated, sometimes don't want to partner as quickly. And I think those of us, you know, when you're successful, sometimes you think you know what you're doing. And what we found is that organizations that are oftentimes on the margins addressing the issue, that may not be as well developed, have the best back office situation going for them, oftentimes are the first to step up to the plate to work together. I think they recognize that they know that they need other people to be able to be successful. Having said that, when those organizations that are the large, sophisticated organizations get on board, which inevitably they almost always do, they're able to take things to a whole nother level. And so getting those two groups together, we've seen to be work really well. Surprisingly, what we found is that federal agencies are quick to show up. It doesn't matter who's in the room. We found that they're some of the most responsive folks that we've worked with, which was certainly wasn't my preconceived notion when we kicked off our work 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I have simultaneously two questions. One, how often do governmental regulations get in the way of effective local actions? And at the same time, how is the current administration's intention to cut money for free school lunches going to impact our society? So
Yeah, it's great questions. Well, I think, you know, so government regulations are, it's a world that I live in too much. And I don't know if that was just because I was such a bad kid in high school that I'm having to pay penance for it now. Preacher's kid, right? And but you know, I mean, so I think one, understanding what the laws are, what the policies are, and why they're there is always important. Oftentimes there's a reason for it. But one of the things that I tell our friends, whether they work in federal agencies or they're policymakers, is that most of these policies, I don't remember any of them being written on the stone tablets, you know, given to Moses. And so they were created by humans to serve humans. And so oftentimes, a lot of these rules and regulations have outlived their usefulness. And so it's time to help them evolve. And so oftentimes the way to help them evolve is through pilot programs. And evaluation. So having a good academic evaluation paired with a pilot project, we found typically will make government agencies a little more amenable to changing some policies if they're not working. In terms of, you know, working with, doing the kind of work that we do, thinking about the changing administrations and so forth, it's oftentimes it feels like, you know, we did a program this summer in partnership with this administration that ended up serving 480,000 meals to kids in rural East and West Texas that would not have gotten a summer meal without this intervention. And then the next day after we release this report, we find out that restrictions are being cut for 700,000 people around the country that are going to lose benefits. And it does seem sometimes like we're constantly pushing a boulder up the hill that seems to kind of roll over us periodically. But I think that's part of it. I think there's a reason that social change happens, but it happens slowly. And I think that part of it is just sticking to it and continuing the pathway forward and building relationships with people that are different than you. So we spend a lot of time developing relationships with people on both sides of the aisle, because Republicans are not going to end hunger by themselves and Democrats aren't going to end hunger by themselves. The only way that we can possibly end hunger in our country is if we all work together. And so really understanding where they come from, understanding why they're putting forth some of these regulations, and then doing everything we can in our power when it's appropriate to persuade them otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are questions here about food deserts, and I wonder if you could talk about some solutions that you've discovered.
Yeah, food desert. So if you're not familiar with the term food desert, basically it means that you live in a community that doesn't have access to healthy food. So if you live in a rural area, ironically, you might be surrounded by food from farmland that's not yours, that you don't have access to, and you probably don't have a grocery store, because grocery stores have almost all closed down in rural America. Or if you go into an urban low-income neighborhood, they may not have a grocery store, and so people are oftentimes going to corner stores or convenience stores to be able to buy food. They also might go to a McDonald's and hit the value menu, which are oftentimes provide people enough food. It gives people the feeling that they're full, but obviously it can have adverse effects on nutrition and diet-related disease. So what we've seen that are creative solutions, of course, this project where we mailed boxes of food to people, to children in rural East and West Texas was great. But one of my favorite ones is in Waco. We have an organization, a community development organization called Mission Waco, and they bought an old convenience store, and with the help of the community, both large and the intimate community where they work, they created the Jubilee Market. And it is a nonprofit grocery store. It doesn't make a profit, but the area grocery stores even went in to help them out. And you can get anything. You can get fresh, great food there, and it's really helped curb the problem of the food desert in that particular community. We're all watching it very closely because we want to see if this is a replicable situation. What we're probably going to find is that it may not ever make enough money to be considered a profitable business. Most grocery stores have a 1% profit margin. So it's a very tough business to get into and break even. But what we're finding is that it's going to save the community on the back end in terms of public health costs around medications and hospital interventions. It's going to be a much cheaper solution that the community can choose to co-invest in to be able to make that a resource available. So that's one of my favorite things that I've seen in food deserts.
I'm glad you talked about that. Yeah. Can you build hunger-free coalitions without extra money for food? Is reorganization or new collaborations ever enough?
Yeah, so there's a lot of money available for food that goes unspent. So if you think about, this is something I didn't know, that the way federal programming works. So every kid that's eligible for the free introduced lunch program in your community is also eligible for breakfast before school or during school. And then many of them, any kid that is involved in an after-school activity is also eligible for an after-school meal. And so those are resources that essentially we've already paid for. We've already determined as a country that we want to allocate our resources to those issues. So if you have these programs in existence, but you're not utilizing them to their fullest capacity, then you have kids that are going hungry and resources at the ready that are going unused. And so you need to use those resources. It also allows you to use your philanthropic resources in the community, which are a much smaller percentage of the total equation, to address the gaps where you don't have maybe federal resources or big programs that exist. So you think about backpack programs, weekend meals, There are no big resources for that. So those are a great way for a church to partner. Meals on Wheels, I think is my favorite program, I think, of any anti-hunger program, because you're getting to do a couple of things. One, you're delivering a hot meal to somebody who would not have had a meal without your intervention, and you're cultivating a relationship with them. So all faith traditions talk about this issue, but the Hindu scriptures say to give food is to give life. And if you think about it, when you are getting together with your family, or you're getting together with your friends, what are you doing? You're eating. So it's not just about food, it's about that human connection. And so we think about the elderly in our community all across the country who not only don't have access to food, but they don't have access to that human connection. And the Meals on Wheels program is a great example of a program that is intervening on both levels. So I love that program. I love that about the program. But the resources are being cut on the federal level, to your point earlier. And so this is a great way for churches and nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, or just you that are just generous and have resources to be able to come alongside organizations in these kinds of programs. It's a critical program that needs more resources, because the waiting line is always much longer than the actual ability to address it.
Thank you. A student asks, at what point in the food system, be it the growing of food, the accessibility, or the abilities of family to afford food, at what point would you consider grammar? What's the most effective point of focus when it comes to addressing hunger, or do we need to hit them all?
I think the way to comprehensively address hunger is through these hunger-free community coalition models. So like in Dallas, they've got subcommittees that are focused on senior nutrition or child nutrition or accessibility of healthy food. And so that really, to me, is the Cadillac model of addressing hunger, both on the local level and then doing the same thing on a state level. When we kicked off our work, we had 3 state agencies that were administering programs for low-income Texans, and our 3 commissioners were appointed by the same political party, and they never met each other. And so if they hadn't met each other, then I knew their teams were probably not working together to address the issue on the local level. So building this collaborative response at every level is the only way I think we move forward as a nation. And that's a great irony, because we're also more polarized today than we've ever been before. And so isn't it ironic in a way that seems divinely oriented, that our only way forward is to work together at a time when we can't agree on almost anything. But that is the way, I think, to justice and true peace for our communities.
On a very different note, a student asks, what are your opinions, if you have any, on insect farms and the eating of insects as a way of lowering hunger in our country?
Yeah, that's kudos to that student. And so we do work with a lot of ag scientists, and this is what they're looking at. It's not only how do we produce enough food to feed the world that exists right now, but knowing that our population is continuing to explode. How do we feed people at 2050 when our population doubles or triples? And so all these things are critical to being able to address the issue. And I'll say this is a little bit, this isn't exactly to that point, but something, a thought to leave you with is that one of the people that I find the most inspiration from, or that I've found the most inspiration from, is William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was the British parliamentarian during the 18th century that committed his life to solving or to ending the British slave trade. And one of his biographers said, so he spent his whole career working on that one issue, and they passed legislation to end the British slave trade 3 days before he died. He literally committed his life to the cause. Incredible inspiration. But one of his biographers noted or suggested that actually wasn't his greatest accomplishment. That his greatest accomplishment was ending the very idea that slavery was an acceptable form of commerce. Because by ending the idea that it was an acceptable form of commerce, he altered human history. Because slavery was just a way that we did business for thousands of years before that. He completely transformed how we understand economic conditions. And I think the same is true for us today. we just assume that poverty and hunger are just the way that the world is. But they are human conditions that we have the capacity to address. And just like Wilberforce was able to end the idea that slavery was an acceptable form of commerce, we have to end the idea that hunger and poverty are acceptable social conditions. So,
on that note, I'll thank you. I want to thank the Holland Home for underwriting today's presentation.
Thank you.